It's June 18th, 1815. I'm standing on the fields of Waterloo, what we now call Belgium, and let me tell you, I look downright sharp. My red coat catches the light like polished glass, brass buttons gleaming in the sun, and my hat sitting just right on my head. But I'm not just dressed for show. I'm ready for business. My trusty brown Bess musket is loaded and firm in my hands, and I'm part of a solid defensive square, shoulder to shoulder with my mates. Then the French cavalry comes charging in. I pull the trigger, smoke fills the air, and just like that, they go down. It's over. Victory. We've won. Feels good, doesn't it? Songs will be sung about us, and funny enough, one of them will even go on to win the Eurovision Song Contest a century and a half from now. Whatever that is. It's a nice thought, really, all neat and heroic. But, let's be honest, that's pure fantasy. It's not Hollywood, not even close. It's more like the kind of story you'd find painted on a tin of biscuits or a fancy box of chocolates. The truth? It's filthy, brutal, and soaked in blood. It's the kind of truth that kills men. Take the Battle of Albuera in 1811. Down on the Iberian Peninsula, nearly 7,000 British, Spanish, and Portuguese soldiers were either dead or wounded. The French lost about 8,000 themselves. Then there was Quatre Bras in Belgium just 2 days before Waterloo. Both sides losing over 4,000 men in that fight alone. And at Waterloo, Napoleon's forces lost around 25,000 men. A staggering defeat, but not surprising given the scale of that battle. Even the victorious Duke of Wellington paid dearly, losing about 17,000 of his own. At least 3,500 of those were confirmed dead, though historians reckon the true number might be nearly double. And Wellington's allies, the Prussians under Old Field Marshal Blücher, lost another 1,100 men. No two ways about it, these battles were absolute bloodbaths. If you or I had been there, we wouldn't have stood a chance. And truthfully, we might have been done for before the fighting even started. There's an old saying that an army marches on its stomach. Some say it was Napoleon who said it, others claim Frederick the Great. Maybe it was neither. Doesn't matter much. The point stands. If soldiers aren't fed, they can't fight. So what did a British soldier get to eat each day? Well, the official rations were something like this: 1.5 pounds of bread or flour, or if you were unlucky, just a pound of ship's biscuit. Then came a pound of beef or half a pound of pork, a quarter pint of dried peas, and about an ounce of cheese or butter. Throw in another ounce of rice, and that was your lot. Honestly, it doesn't sound too terrible at first glance. That comes to around 2,466 calories. Just enough to keep a young man in his 20s on his feet. Barely, but still. And according to Private Wheeler, one of the lads back then, the food wasn't all bad. He once said, "It's true we were sometimes short on biscuit, but all things considered, no army was supplied better." Of course, that rosy view faded fast when supply lines broke down. Once the army had been out in the field for too long, food started to rot and turn foul. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Napier put it bluntly. "We're living on biscuits crawling with maggots, and though I consider myself a good soldier, I'll be damned if I can enjoy maggots." If you had some coins to spare, you could try buying fresh food from local sellers. Otherwise, well, you might end up scavenging from the dead. Rifleman Harris once spotted a few fallen French soldiers, their rations scattered in the dirt. He didn't hesitate. He bent down, scraped the blood off the biscuits with his bayonet, and devoured them. Hunger does that to a man. When it came to drink, though, the rations sounded a bit more generous. Every day we got our fair share of drink. 5 pints of small beer, or if luck was on your side, a pint of wine or half a pint of spirits. Now, that beer wasn't like the strong stuff you get today. It was weak, maybe 2% alcohol at best, but after a long march, even that mild brew gave you something to look forward to. The trouble was, all that daily drinking built up a serious dependency among British soldiers. It was comforting in the moment, sure, but it turned into a real problem later on. Something we'll get to before long. But before we wander off into that mess, let's stick with the topic of diet for a bit, because what you ate didn't tell the whole story. You also have to consider just how much work you were putting in every single day. On campaign, there wasn't much rest, it was constant movement, constant effort. We'd march anywhere from 10 to 15 miles a day, and not at a stroll either. The pace was brisk enough that even the supply wagons and baggage trains had to hustle to keep up. Some units had it worse. Take Wellington's Light Division, for instance. They once covered 40 miles in just 26 hours. A grueling, record-setting push that left men half dead on their feet. Nowadays, people talk about taking 6,000 to 8,000 steps a day to stay healthy. That's maybe 3 or 4 miles. By comparison, we were doubling or tripling that every day, and doing it with gear, weapons, and packs on our backs. Honestly, a better modern comparison would be a middleweight boxer in training. Those guys burn through 3,000 to 5,000 calories a day easy. When you look at it that way, those 2,466 daily calories we got from rations suddenly don't seem like much at all. As one soldier, John Spencer Cooper, once said, "Any man thinking of joining the army ought to leave half his stomach behind." He wasn't wrong. And if all that endless marching and hunger ever got too much for you, if you dared to complain out loud, well, that could be a mistake you'd regret. Lieutenant Thomas Blood told a story about one poor fool in the Light Division at Cuidado Riddo in 1811. The man had mouthed off to his officers, using improper and disrespectful language. As Blood put it, they dragged him before a drumhead court-martial and sentenced him to a whipping, 50 or maybe 100 lashes. Blood said it worked, though. That put an end to his mutinous conduct, and we heard no more from him. Not everyone was so easily straightened out. Lieutenant Colonel James Fane recalled that some men were simply beyond redemption, that harsh punishment only made them worse. In some desperate characters, he said, severe punishment hardened rather than reformed. And sometimes the lash didn't just harden a man, it killed him. Take the case of John Fernall in 1822, a bit after the Napoleonic Wars but still worth mentioning. He was accused of stealing a spoon, just a spoon, and sentenced to 300 lashes. They carried out every stroke of that sentence. He never recovered. The man lingered in agony for days before dying from his wounds. As awful as that sounds, dying under the lash wasn't even the most common way to go. Most soldiers didn't fall in battle or under punishment. They died of disease. Typhus, dysentery, and other sicknesses swept through camps like wildfire. During the Peninsular campaigns, more than 24,000 men died of disease, compared to about 6,700 killed in action. That means roughly 3 out of every 4 deaths came not from bullets or bayonets, but from illness. Still, don't let that make you think the battlefield was any safer. If you were unlucky enough to find yourself in a real Napoleonic fight, you'd probably wish you hadn't. There was no easing into it, no training exercise to warm you up. One minute you were standing there, heart pounding. The next, all hell broke loose. That's exactly what happened to William Greene, a young bugler who found himself at the siege of Badajoz on April 6, 1812. As dusk settled over the Spanish hills, he could see the massive fortress rising in the distance. A dark, jagged shape against the horizon. He and his comrades had one job that night: take it or die trying. The moment they advanced, the night exploded. Gunfire flashed, smoke rolled across the fields, and the air filled with the crack of muskets and the roar of cannon. Greene felt a sudden sting in his thigh, then a searing, crushing pain in his wrist. It felt more like a 6-pounder cannonball than a musket shot, he said later. The blast shattered the bone, severed tendons, and left blood pouring from both wounds. He collapsed right there, the battle raging around him, and that was the end of his war. The siege of Badajoz was over for him before it even truly began. And as grim as his story sounds, Greene was actually one of the lucky ones. While I lay there bleeding in the dark, my unit pressed on, straight into a death trap. The French defenders at Badajoz had planned everything with cruel precision. They'd packed the trench below the wall with gunpowder, setting a deadly surprise for anyone who dared get close. And when our men stormed in, the French lit the fuse. In an instant, the world erupted. My comrades were blown apart. Men I'd marched beside, eaten with, laughed with, gone in a flash of fire and smoke. Those who somehow survived the blast were immediately met with another horror: a relentless barrage of shells raining down from the city walls above. I could only lie there, half-conscious, watching it unfold. The night sky flickered with explosions as screams echoed through the ditch. Our men were in the trench, I later recalled. while the enemy had shells waiting on the walls above. Each time one burst, 10 or 12 men were torn apart and thrown in every direction. I had been part of what they called the Forlorn Hope, the first wave of soldiers sent to storm the enemy's defenses. It was a title that said it all. The job was suicidal by nature. Rush the wall, take the enemy by surprise, and pray you lived long enough to see the next morning. But there was no surprise that night at Badajoz. Lieutenant General Thomas Picton had already launched an earlier attack from the eastern side of the fortress, so the French knew another assault from the south was inevitable. Add to that the fact that our cannons had been pounding their walls for days. When the guns suddenly stopped, the defenders knew exactly what that silence meant. When the order came to charge, the Forlorn Hope went first and most never came back. French mines and shellfire wiped them out almost to a man. And truth be told, that kind of bloodshed wasn't unique to Badajoz. It was the same story at places like Ciudad Rodrigo and San Sebastián in 1813. Still, as mad as it sounds, many soldiers actually wanted to be part of the Forlorn Hope. It was considered an honor, a test of bravery and manhood. Some even volunteered for it. If you somehow made it out alive, you could earn a promotion or a badge marking you as a hero. It was dangerous beyond belief, but the promise of glory, or maybe just recognition, was enough for some men to take the risk. And even if you did survive those first brutal minutes, the fight was far from over. Death came in many forms on a Napoleonic battlefield. At long range, the greatest threat was the cannonball, those solid iron spheres that screamed through the air like thunder. They weighed anywhere from 5 to 12 pounds and flew at nearly 450 meters per second. If one of those hit you in the head or chest, you were finished instantly, nothing left to bury. I saw men literally torn in half by those things. A hit to an arm or leg might not kill you outright, but it would rip the limb clean off, and if infection didn't set in later, you'd count yourself lucky. Even a glancing blow could be fatal. One British officer, William Howe Delancey, was struck by a ricocheting cannonball at Waterloo in 1815. Strangely enough, it didn't even break his skin, but the internal damage was horrific. 8 ribs ripped away from his spine, his organs and muscles crushed beyond repair. He somehow lived through the battle itself, only to die 8 weeks later in terrible pain. As the fighting closed in, the French would switch to a shorter-range weapon, grapeshot. Instead of a single heavy cannonball, the gunners packed their cannons with a canvas bag filled with dozens of small iron or lead balls, each about an inch wide. When fired, it turned the cannon into a monstrous shotgun. A single blast could tear through entire ranks of men. One of those iron balls could shatter a bone so completely that the limb would become what the surgeons called comminuted, smashed into tiny splinters. There was no fixing that. The only option was amputation. If the balls didn't break bone, they ripped through skin and muscle, leaving wide, gaping wounds that no doctor could properly clean. Men bled out where they fell, or if they survived the night, infection would finish what the cannon hadn't. There was no glory in it. Only chaos, blood, and the sound of men realizing, far too late, what war really was. When it came to firearms, most soldiers, myself included, carried a musket. The standard issue was the land pattern musket, better known to history as the Brown Bess. She was heavy, clumsy, and smoked like a chimney when fired, but she was reliable enough to get the job done. Each shot carried a small iron or lead ball, a lot like the grape shot I mentioned earlier, only smaller, about 45 grams apiece. Now, by today's standards, those old muskets were underpowered. They didn't have the range or precision of modern rifles. But don't let that fool you. When that musket ball hit something, it hit hard. Even from hundreds of yards away, it could blow through bone like wet paper. In fact, a team of Finnish forensic archaeologists ran tests on these weapons in 2024. They built human tissue models to see what kind of damage a Brown Bess could do. The results were brutal. In their tests, a musket ball tore clean through the head of a dummy, shattering the skull on impact. The ball made both an entry and an exit wound, scattering bone and bits of lead throughout the wound. If that had been a real person, there's no question they'd have been dead before they hit the ground. And honestly, none of that was a surprise. We already knew muskets were killers. Just ask Charles Bell, doctor, artist, and one of the surgeons at Waterloo. He was one of the few men who saw firsthand what those musket balls could do and had the skill to paint it afterward. Bell's watercolors are haunting. One shows a soldier with wild, glassy eyes and what looks like a musket ball or a fragment of shrapnel lodged deep in his skull. Others show men with their eyes blown out, faces crushed by blunt trauma, and limbs grotesquely swollen with infection after being shot. But even those weren't the worst of Bell's drawings. Some showed men with their scalps split open, others with intestines spilling from holes in their sides. These weren't musket wounds at all. They were the work of the saber. The saber was a long, curved blade, about 84 centimeters on average, though some were even longer, and at close range it was every bit as deadly as a bullet. There's a piece of skull still kept today at the Surgeons' Hall Museum in Edinburgh, believed to be from a French soldier killed at Waterloo. It's a horrifying thing to look at, gouged and slashed by saber strikes so deep they nearly reached the brain. Even a glancing cut would have drawn rivers of blood. A full hit? That was usually fatal. And yet, somehow, some men survived it all. Take French Marshal Nicolas Oudinot, for example, the luckiest unlucky man who ever lived. Over 20 years of fighting, he collected more than 20 serious wounds. 10 from gunfire, 1 right to the head, 9 from saber cuts, 1 across his neck, a grape shot wound in the chest, and even a broken femur for good measure. You'd think that'd be enough to finish anyone, but Oudinot lived to the age of 80 and died peacefully in Paris in 1847. A walking miracle, really. Now let's say you've made it that far too. Survived the musket balls, the sabers, the cannon fire, and the battle's finally winding down. You'd probably start to feel pretty confident, maybe even think you've earned your ticket home. But not so fast. In truth, the bloodiest moments of battle often came right at the end. At Vittoria in 1813, the French line collapsed completely. What followed was chaos. Soldiers running for their lives, tossing their weapons aside, abandoning cannons and supplies in their desperate flight. Many were cut down where they stood. Something similar almost happened to us at Waterloo. The French cavalry charged us again and again, and there were moments when it looked like the British line might break. If we'd lost our nerve and bolted, it would have been a massacre. But somehow we held. The Prussians arrived in time to turn the tide, and the French army, the same one that had terrified Europe for years, ended up in full retreat. Their losses were staggering. Still, even when the British weren't the ones running, the aftermath of victory could be ugly, sickeningly so. Winning didn't necessarily bring out the best in men. There was an unspoken rule that after a battle, soldiers could help themselves to a bit of plunder. A kind of grim thank you for enduring the horrors of war. Officially, it was a war crime. Unofficially, it happened all the time. And once the discipline broke down, well, there was no stopping it. After days of marching and fighting, after living on bad food and worse liquor, men snapped. They drank, they looted, they burned, and they did things no decent man would ever speak of afterward. War has a way of stripping men down to their worst instincts, and victory, more often than not, just gave them permission to show it. At Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz in 1812, and again at San Sebastián in 1813, all hell broke loose. After the fighting ended, British and Portuguese troops went on a drunken rampage. One British officer on the Peninsular Campaign later wrote that every house presented a scene of plunder, debauchery, and bloodshed, acts of wanton cruelty committed against defenseless civilians by our own soldiers. It's hard to read those words and not feel ashamed. Civilians were slaughtered, homes were set ablaze, and what little peace the townspeople had was shattered as our troops looted, drank, and gorged themselves on stolen food and wine. At Ciudad Rodrigo, things got so out of hand that several drunken soldiers actually drowned. Not in battle, but in vats of wine they'd broken open. That's the kind of madness war breeds. And it gets darker still. There was plenty of what we can only call sexual violence, the kind too horrific for most accounts to fully describe. For days, the chaos continued. Officers struggled desperately to restore order, but by then, the damage was done. The same soldiers sent to liberate these towns had turned on the very people they were supposed to protect. Historian Alastair Hickson later wrote about another of these incidents, the sacking of Salamanca in 1813. Even Wellington himself, who'd seen just about everything war could throw at a man, called his own troops the scum of the earth. And sadly, Looking at the behavior of some men during those days, it's hard to argue. Of course, not every soldier took part in the rampage. Many were disgusted by it, sickened even, but others, if they hadn't been lying half-dead from wounds, might have joined in. If you were one of the injured, though, you weren't thinking about loot or revenge. You were just hoping to stay alive. 2 days after the fighting ended at Badajoz, while the surviving troops were still drunk and celebrating in the ruins, a British Army surgeon named Walter Henry made his way to the breached wall. What he found there was beyond comprehension. He described a frightful heap of 1,400 or 1,500 British soldiers, many dead but still warm, mixed with the desperately wounded to whom no help could be given. Burned bodies, men blown apart by cannonballs and grapeshot, soldiers blackened by explosions, all piled together in one enormous, horrific mound. The wounded screamed and cried out for aid, but there was no one to hear them, no one coming to help. Many died right where they fell, too weak or too far gone to move. If by some miracle you were found still breathing, you'd be carried, or more likely dragged, back to camp for treatment. But that word didn't mean what it does today. The surgeons of the British Army Medical Department, the AMD, did their best, and in fairness, they were pioneers in their time. Much of that progress was thanks to a man named James McGregor, Wellington's principal medical officer during the Peninsular War and later the Director General of the AMD. McGregor was one of the finest surgeons of his era, and under his leadership, the department achieved something remarkable. In 1812, they treated an entire division, about 7,000 men, and got them back on their feet to fight again. That kind of efficiency helped turn the tide of war. But even with McGregor's improvements, the treatments themselves were the stuff of nightmares. His advances included better ways to stop bleeding, quicker methods for amputations, and even drilling holes into skulls to relieve pressure from head wounds. It wasn't about comfort, it was about timing and survival. And here's the grim part. These surgeons still had no understanding of bacteria or infection, and hardly any real painkillers. So if your leg had to come off, you were wide awake for the whole thing. You'd feel every slice, every tug, every saw stroke. And afterward, all you could do was pray the wound didn't fester and kill you in the days to come. But let's imagine the best-case scenario, that somehow you made it through. You didn't die from blood loss, shock, or infection. You endured the pain, the filth, the fever, and you lived. Well then, congratulations. You'd survived the whole damned ordeal. By some miracle, you made it. You survived the forced marches through the Iberian Peninsula, the choking smoke of the sieges, the grapeshot and saber slashes of Waterloo, and somehow, against all odds, you came home. You're part of a victorious army now, a hero in red. You've got your pay, your bonuses, maybe even a small nest egg from years of service. Let's be generous and say you've got a trade waiting for you. Perhaps a cobbler's bench or a spot on a farm. If you can push the nightmares aside, life should finally be good. But that's the cruel thing about war, it doesn't end just because the fighting does. When the Napoleonic Wars finally drew to a close, Britain found itself in crisis. The economy that had thrived on years of wartime spending suddenly collapsed. The government's massive military budget vanished overnight. Demand for goods plummeted, and entire industries folded. The job market was already stretched thin, and then hundreds of thousands of soldiers came flooding home, all looking for work that no longer existed. Many of them were maimed or crippled, relying on families who could barely feed themselves. And Britain's global trade dominance, once secured by its powerful naval blockade, slipped away. Then came the Corn Laws of 1815, passed to protect Britain's farmers but disastrous for everyone else. They sent food prices soaring, leaving working families hungry and desperate. For the men returning from war, men who expected parades, gratitude, maybe even stability, life was instead filled with hardship, poverty, and disappointment. Heroes quickly became burdens. The country they'd bled for seemed to have forgotten them. That brings me to one man's story, a man who, in many ways, stood for all of them. His name was John Lees. John was just a boy when he joined Wellington's army. 15 years old, swept up in the promise of glory. He enlisted in the Royal Artillery in 1812 and worked as a wagon driver, hauling powder and shot to the guns at Waterloo in 1815. He was there for the thunder and terror of that final victory. When the war ended, John returned home to Oldham, near Manchester. His father owned a cotton mill, but John himself was illegitimate, which meant no inheritance, no security, just his wits and his labor. What he found back home shocked him. The same soldiers who'd fought for Britain's honor were now starving in its streets, abandoned by a government that had no more use for them. So when a mass protest was organized in August 1819, a peaceful march calling for political reform and fair representation, John joined the crowd. The demonstrators set out from Oldham towards St. Peter's Field in Manchester, filled with hope that maybe their voices would finally be heard. But to Prime Minister Lord Liverpool and the authorities in Manchester, that gathering looked less like a plea for reform and more like the start of a rebellion. The order came down: stop it at all costs. When the celebrated speaker Henry Hunt arrived to address the crowd, he surrendered peacefully, but the magistrates panicked. They called in the yeomanry and the hussars. Swords drawn, they charged into the crowd of unarmed men, women, and children. In the chaos that followed, hundreds were injured. Among them was John Lees. Witnesses later said they saw him trying to fend off the sabers with nothing but a walking stick. He raised his arm to protect his head. One man, Joseph Wrigley, recalled, and was struck again and again. I saw the blade cut deep into his right arm. John somehow managed to get away and even reported for work at the mill later that same day. But over the following weeks, his wounds worsened. Infection set in. On September 9, 1819, John Lees died, one of 18 people killed in what would forever be known as the Waterloo Massacre. It's said that when they lifted him into his coffin, blood poured from his mouth. One final, awful reminder of what had been done to him. He was 22 years old. 22. He'd survived Napoleon's cannons and Wellington's brutal discipline, only to die on the streets of Manchester, cut down by his own countrymen, less than 10 miles from home. For thousands of others, the end wasn't as dramatic, but it was no less tragic. They weren't struck down by sabers or trampled under horses. They were simply worn down, ground into the dust by an economy that forgot them, a government that ignored them, and a nation that had moved on. And that, perhaps, is the hardest truth of all. Sometimes surviving the war is the easy part. It's living with what comes after that breaks a man.